The scream that ripped Elias from his sleep wasn't real, but the blood was. It was always there, pooling in the corners of his mind, slick and dark on the floorboards of his memory. He bolted upright in his cot, the rough wool blanket scratching at his sweat-soaked skin, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner trying to escape. Outside, the Wyoming storm raged, a wild chorus of wind and rain that sounded just like her scream. His wife's face flickered behind his eyes, a ghost of a smile, then the terror, then his daughters, their laughter silenced. 5 years, 5 years of this cabin, this self-imposed prison squatting under a jagged cliff. 5 years of sagebrush and shadows for company. He was a ghost himself, a man of 40 winters who looked 100, hollowed out by a grief so vast it had its own weather. He reached for the rifle that never left his side. The cold steel was a familiar comfort, the only thing he trusted anymore. Its weight was a promise, never again. Never again would he be helpless. Crack, not thunder, closer, sharper. Then it came again, a fist pounding on his door, heavy, desperate. Elias froze. No one came out this far. No one even knew he was here. He'd made sure of that. His cabin wasn't a home. It was a fortress built to keep the world and all its pain out. He moved from the bed, his bare feet silent on the cold wood floor. The ghost in his head screamed at him. Don't open it. Remember what happened last time. Remember the blood. The pounding grew more frantic. A voice cut through the wind, sharp and female. Help us, please. His hand tightened on the rifle. His voice was gravel, torn from a throat long unused. Who's there? Soldiers are coming. We need shelter. Now. His gut twisted. Soldiers. The word was a venomous snake striking at the heart of his memory. He remembered a glint of metal in the dark 5 years ago, a soldier's badge on the chest of a man they called a bandit. He crept to the door, his heart a frantic drum against the silence of the cabin. He peered through a tiny crack in the wood. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in a brilliant, terrifying flash. 10 figures, cloaked in soaked hides, their faces grim and set. All women, Apache. Their eyes burned with a mixture of fear and defiance that he recognized in himself. One step forward, her dark braid plastered to her face by the rain. Her gaze was like flint, hard and unyielding. My name is Ayanna, she said, her voice carrying over the storm. Let us in, or we die out here. Behind her, another woman clutched a bundle to her chest, a baby, and in that tiny, vulnerable form, Elias saw the face of his own daughter. The ghost wasn't just whispering anymore. It was screaming. He cursed a raw, ragged sound. The promise he'd made to himself, never again, warred with the image of that child. Get in, he snarled, swinging the heavy door wide. They slipped inside, bringing the storm with them, the smell of wet leather, rain, and a fear so thick he could taste it. He slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the small space. The cabin, his sanctuary of solitude, was breached, and the ghosts of his past whispered a single, chilling promise. You will regret this. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. The 10 women huddled near the hearth, their silence a heavy blanket in the cramped cabin. Elias stood apart, his rifle still gripped in his hands, watching them, watching Ayanna. She hadn't sat down. She stood tall, a sentinel radiating a coiled energy that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The water dripped from her buckskin clothes, forming a small puddle at her feet, but she seemed not to notice. Her eyes, dark and fierce, were fixed on the door, listening. Outside, the storm howled, but beneath the wind, a new sound was growing. A rhythmic, drumming thunder that wasn't from the sky. Hoofbeats. They're close, Ayanna said, her voice low and sharp as a shard of obsidian. Captain Morrison, he'll be leading them. Elias's jaw tightened. Why are soldiers hunting you? Ayanna's gaze shifted from the door to him. There was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, burning rage. Morrison and his men burned our village. They slaughtered our kin. They came for the gold in our hills, and when we resisted, they took everything. Her voice dropped. becoming a near whisper laced with venom. He hunts us now to silence the truth, to bury his sins under our bodies. The words hit Elias like a physical blow. Bury his sins. The ghost in his head screamed. He saw the fire that had consumed his own home. He heard his wife's pleas. The men who'd done it, they'd called themselves bandits, scavengers. But he remembered that badge. He remembered the crisp blue of a uniform sleeve in the firelight. He'd told the law, but no one had listened. A lone rancher's word against the wind. His fingers twitched on the rifle's trigger. Why my cabin? Of all the places to run, why here? We weren't running to you, Ayanna said, her eyes seeming to strip him bare, to see the rot of grief inside him. We were running to this. She gestured vaguely at the cliffs outside. This land. We needed a place to make a stand. A place no one would think to look. Her gaze met his again. We needed a ghost home. And his guns. He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. I'm no hero, just a man who already lost everything. Then you know why we can't lose, she snapped back, her intensity startling him. You know what it is to have nothing left to offer but a fight. And that's when he noticed it. The other women were shifting. The shivering refugees who had stumbled out of the storm were gone. In their place were something else entirely. One woman, younger than the rest, had pulled a long, coiled rope whip from beneath her cloak. She tested its weight, her movements fluid and practiced. Another, an older woman with scars on her face, was checking the string on a short, powerful-looking bow. Knives appeared in their hands, the firelight gleaming off polished steel. They weren't victims. They were warriors. The entire display of helplessness had been an act, a mask to get them through his door. You fooled me, he muttered, a strange mix of anger and admiration churning in his gut. A corner of Ayanna's mouth curled up, a gesture that held no warmth. We fool everyone, she said. It's the only way a woman survives in a world of men like Morrison. His eyes darted to the woman with the baby. She clutched the child tighter, her knuckles white. The fear in her eyes was different from the others. It wasn't the cold defiance of a warrior. It was the raw, primal terror of a mother. The child, Elias said, his voice softer than he intended. Is she yours? Ayanna's expression changed. The hard mask cracked for just a second, revealing a pain so deep it mirrored his own. She was my sister's, she said quietly. The baby is all that's left of her. Morrison's men. They didn't spare anyone. Elias had to turn away. He stared into the fire, the flames blurring as the image of his youngest daughter's face rose from the embers, her laugh stolen from the world by a blade in the dark. The ache in his chest was a physical thing, a crushing weight that never eased. What's your plan? He asked, his back still to them. You can't fight 20 soldiers from this cabin. It's a wooden tomb. We don't plan to hide, Ayanna said, her voice regaining its iron edge. We plan to fight. We know the men who ride with Morrison. 20, maybe a few more. They'll be here by dawn. He finally turned back to face her, the absurdity of it all forcing a hollow laugh from his chest. You're insane. 10 women and a broken-down rancher against a company of soldiers. We are not asking you to die for us, she said, stepping closer. Her presence was immense, filling the small cabin. We are asking you to stand with us. This is your land. You know it better than they do. The cliffs, the gullies, the traps you've set. His eyes widened. How could she know about the traps? She saw the question on his face. We have watched you, she admitted. For weeks. We watched the ghost of the lonely ranch. We saw you check your perimeter. We saw the steel jaws hidden in the brush. We didn't choose this place by accident, Elias. He was speechless. They hadn't just stumbled upon him. They had chosen him. They had studied him. He was a part of their plan, whether he liked it or not. The ghost screamed at him. It's a trick. They're using you. You'll lose everything all over again. But Ayanna's eyes held him fast. They weren't pleading. They were challenging him. The other women watched, silent and ready. They weren't asking for a savior. They were asking for an ally. The hoofbeats were closer now, a steady, menacing rhythm. Time was running out. His hands began to tremble, not with fear, but with the terrifying weight of a choice he thought he'd never have to make again. Could he slam the door on the world one last time and let them die, preserving his own empty life? Or could he pick up his gun and fight alongside them, knowing that the battle might not just kill him, but force him to feel again? Elias stared into the fire, the embers glowing like the eyes of a predator. Ayana's words echoed in the tense silence of the cabin. "We are asking you to stand with us." It wasn't a plea for help. It was a summons. A call to arms for a soldier who thought he'd long since deserted the world of the living. The ghosts of his family screamed their warnings. Run, hide, survive. That's all that matters. That's what he had done for 5 years. He had survived, but Ayana was right. He wasn't living. He was a dead man waiting for his body to catch up. From the corner of the room, the baby let out a soft whimper. The sound cut through the roar of the storm and the screaming in his head. It was the most alive sound he had heard in years. He looked at the young mother, at the fierce, desperate love in her eyes as she rocked the child. He saw his wife, he saw his daughters, he saw everything he had lost, and everything he could not bear to see lost again. He turned from the fire, his decision hardening his face into a mask of grim resolve. "All right," he said, the single word feeling like a boulder rolling off his chest. "I'm in." Ayana didn't smile. She didn't offer thanks. She simply nodded, a look of fierce purpose in her eyes. "Good," she said. "There is no time to waste. Show us your defenses. Show us your teeth." Elias felt a surge of something he hadn't felt since before the fire, before the blood. Adrenaline. Purpose. He strode to the back of the cabin, the women moving behind him like a pack of wolves, silent and alert. He shoved aside a heavy crate of dried goods, the wood scraping against the floor. Beneath it was a rectangular outline he'd cut into the floorboards himself. He lifted the trapdoor, revealing a set of steep wooden stairs leading down into darkness. The air that rose from below was cold and smelled of damp earth and rust. He lit a lantern, and the flickering light revealed his secret armory. It wasn't a cellar full of food. It was a tomb of forgotten violence. Rusted bear traps with jaws like grinning sharks hung from the stone walls. Coils of wicked-looking tripwire, thin and sharp as a razor, were spooled on pegs. Crates were filled with caltrops, small, jagged pieces of iron designed to cripple a horse or pierce a man's boot. They were relics from his time in the war and from the paranoid years that followed, when he'd first tried to build a life out here. "Old habits," Elias muttered, his voice rough. Ayana descended the stairs, her eyes scanning the deadly collection with expert appraisal. She picked up a bear trap, testing the tension of the spring. Her fingers traced the iron teeth without a hint of fear. "These will do more than slow them," she said, a grim satisfaction in her voice. She turned to her warriors, her voice cracking like a whip. "Nia, take the caltrops. You know the eastern trail where it narrows. Scatter them thick in the mud. Kara, the tripwires. In the gully, low to the ground where the shadows are deepest." The women moved without a word, their efficiency stunning. Nia, the one with the rope whip, grabbed a heavy sack of caltrops and disappeared up the stairs. Kara, the archer, coiled wire around her arm and followed, melting into the storm outside as if she were born from it. Elias watched them, a knot tightening in his stomach. They were more than warriors. They were a perfectly oiled machine of death. Every part moved with precision, with a shared, unspoken purpose. "You planned all of this," he said to Ayana. It wasn't a question. "You knew I would say yes." She met his gaze, her dark eyes holding his. "I know broken men," she said, her words cutting deeper than any knife. "They either spend their lives hiding from the fight, or they run toward it when it finally corners them." He let out a short, sharp breath. "I'm not cornered." "Aren't you?" she challenged, her voice soft but relentless. "Trapped in this box of memories, waiting for ghosts to give you permission to die. Morrison coming here? It is a gift, Elias. It is a chance to finally fight the monster that made you, instead of just the shadows it left behind." He had to look away. Her perception was so unnervingly accurate. She was right. He hadn't been living. He'd been haunting the scene of his own life's destruction. But now the world had kicked his door down. The world was armed, and it was asking him which side he was on. He cleared his throat, pushing down the turmoil inside him. "The West Ridge," he said, his voice all business now. "It's the best spot for an ambush. It's a narrow path with high ground on both sides. They'll have to come through it single file at dawn. It's a natural choke point. Ayana nodded, her mind already racing. Show me. They stepped out into the gale. The wind and rain hit him like a physical blow, but he barely felt it. Lightning tore across the sky, momentarily lighting up the rugged landscape. The ridge loomed ahead, a jagged spine of rock against the churning clouds. Elias knew every inch of it. He had walked it 1,000 times chasing his ghosts under the moon. Tonight, he would turn it into a weapon. Here, he said, shouting over the wind and pointing to a narrow passage between two massive boulders. We'll put the bear traps in the brush on either side. The tripwires go across the path here and here. He paced it out, his mind once foggy with grief, now sharp and clear as glass. It will break their charge, throw them into chaos. Ayana's eyes scanned the terrain, her tactical mind absorbing every detail. Good, we will draw them into the kill box. Then we split them. I'll take 5 women and create a diversion to the east, draw their attention. You take the others. You'll hit their flank when they're tangled in the traps. He hesitated. I work alone. Not tonight, she said, her voice absolute, leaving no room for argument. You said you were in. This is what in looks like. You want to avenge your family? You want redemption? Earn it. With us. The word hung in the air between them. Redemption. He'd never dared to even think it. The blood of his family felt like a permanent stain on his soul. Not because he had wielded the blade, but because he had been too weak, too slow to stop it. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Fine. The flank it is. They worked through the storm, a silent, deadly team. Elias's hands, which had trembled with memory just an hour before, were now steady as he set the powerful springs of the bear traps. The women moved like phantoms in the rain, planting caltrops, stringing wires with a lethal grace that was both terrifying and beautiful. The young mother, whose name he learned was Tala, stayed close to the cabin, keeping watch, her baby bundled securely against her chest. Her eyes met his once in the darkness, and he saw not just fear, but a fierce, unbending resolve. As the first hint of gray light began to bleed across the eastern horizon, the work was done. The traps were set, the ridge was waiting, the hoofbeats were no longer a distant rumble. They were a thunderous roar, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Elias crouched behind a large boulder, his rifle cool and heavy in his hands. He could feel his heart pounding, a wild, frantic rhythm. Across the ridge, he saw Ayana give him a final look. Her eyes were blazing. No mercy, her gaze seemed to say. Not for Morrison, not for any of them. He nodded back, but as he chambered around, the ghost whispered one final, chilling question. What about mercy for yourself? Dawn broke over the ridge, a blade of cruel gray light cutting through the drizzle. The world was washed in monochrome, a landscape of wet rock and shivering sagebrush. The air was electric with tension, a silence that felt louder than the receding storm. Elias lay flat behind his boulder, the cold stones seeping into his bones. His rifle was an extension of his arm. He could see Kara, Nia, and 2 other women melt into the terrain around him, becoming little more than shadows. A low whistle, mimicking a hawk's cry, sliced through the morning air. It was Ayana's signal. It was time. The thunder of hooves grew to a deafening roar, and then they appeared. A column of blue-coated soldiers, 20 strong, their faces hard and smeared with mud. At their head rode Captain Morrison, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the narrow pass with predatory confidence. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He saw the glint of a silver ring on Morrison's hand as he held the reins, the same ring he'd seen on the man who held his wife down. A white-hot rage, pure and clean, burned away the last of his fear. The ghosts weren't screaming anymore. They were pointing. There. There he is. The first move came from the east. A brilliant flare shot into the sky, followed a second later by a deafening explosion that shook the ridge. Ayana had lit a stick of stolen dynamite. The blast sent dirt and rocks showering down. Horses screamed and reared in panic. Soldiers shouted in confusion, their disciplined line shattering. Just as planned, nearly half of them broke formation and charged toward the source of the explosion, drawn into the diversion. Ayana's warriors let out fierce war cries, their voices echoing off the cliffs, making their small numbers sound like 100. Now, Elias hissed. He led his small team down a shallow gully, moving low and fast. He knew every dip and curve of this land by heart. They emerged on the flank of the remaining soldiers, who were still trying to calm their horses and make sense of the chaos. The first scream wasn't from a woman. It was a soldier, his foot coming down hard on a patch of mud seeded with caltrops. He went down, clutching his leg, his face a mask of agony. Another soldier, rushing to his aid, stumbled into a tripwire. The sound of a bear trap snapping shut was like a bone breaking, followed by a shriek of inhuman pain. The kill box was working. The ridge had become a butcher's yard. Elias's group struck from the chaos. Nia's whip was a living thing, a leather snake that cracked through the air and wrapped around a soldier's neck, yanking him from his saddle. Kara was a blur of motion, loosing arrows with impossible speed. One found a soldier's throat, another his chest. Elias raised his rifle, the world narrowing to his front sight. He was back in the war, his movements economical, his aim precise. One shot. A man fell. Another shot. A second man dropped. A third shot found its mark before the soldiers even realized where the attack was coming from. But Elias's eyes weren't on the men he was shooting. They were drawn to a covered wagon at the rear of the column, its canvas flapping in the wind. As the battle raged, he heard a sound that didn't belong, a woman's cry, thin and terrified. And it wasn't an Apache voice. He broke from cover, sprinting, dodging a wild pistol shot. Morrison's men were too scattered, too panicked to stop him. He reached the wagon and tore back the canvas flap. Inside, a young woman with a pale, tear-streaked face cowered, clutching a baby to her chest. She couldn't have been more than 18. "Don't shoot!" she begged, her voice trembling. "Please, I'm not with them." "Who are you?" Elias demanded, his rifle still raised, his heart lurching at the sight of the infant. "Mary," she gasped. "Mary Hendress. I was their cook. They forced me to come. They said they'd kill me if I didn't." The baby began to wail, its tiny fists clenched. Elias felt the world tilt. It was his own nightmare, playing out again right in front of him. A mother, a child, surrounded by violence. He saw his wife's face, heard his daughter's cries from that terrible night. He lowered the rifle. "Get out. Come with me. Now." A bullet pinged off the wooden frame of the wagon, inches from his head. Mary didn't hesitate. She scrambled out, shielding the baby with her body. Elias pushed her behind him, leading her toward the relative safety of a gully. Kara saw them and laid down covering fire, her arrows forcing two soldiers back. A soldier with a saber broke through their line, charging directly at Elias, his face a mask of fury. Elias spun, brought the rifle up, and fired from the hip. The man dropped like a stone, his saber clattering on the rocks. "Stay down," Elias told Mary, his voice rough but steady. He pushed her deep into the gully. "You're safe for now." She nodded, trembling, trying to muffle the baby's cries against her shoulder. Elias turned back to the fight, his chest a hollow ache. Saving them felt like a small, desperate act of penance. But the ghost whispered, "You couldn't save your own." He shook it off. There was no time for that. He rejoined the fight, and soon Ayana's group emerged from the east, their faces grim but triumphant. The diversion had worked perfectly. The soldiers were faltering, caught between two fronts, their numbers dwindling. Morrison was shouting orders, trying to rally his men, but his voice was drowned out by the screams and the gunfire. Elias saw him now, his face a twisted mask of rage and disbelief. He wanted to charge, to end it right there, to put a bullet between the eyes of the man who haunted his nightmares. But Ayana's hand gripped his arm, her touch surprisingly strong. "Not yet," she said, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "He's ours. But first, we finish his dogs." Just as she spoke, a pained cry echoed across the ridge. It wasn't a soldier. One of Ayana's women, the one who had checked her bowstring by the fire, crumpled to the ground, a dark stain blooming on her chest. A fresh wave of rage washed over Elias. He slammed another clip into his rifle, his eyes locking on Morrison. The captain's remaining men were trying to form a defensive circle. But there were only 10 or 12 of them left. The traps and the ambush had cost them dearly. From the gully, Mary's voice, small and trembling, reached him. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. The ghosts were too loud, the fight too close. But her question lodged itself in his mind. Why? Was it for redemption? For revenge? Or was it for something simpler? For the child in the gully? For the chance, just once, to stand between the innocent and the monsters? He pushed forward, rifle ready, as the ridge burned with the light of the rising sun. Victory was in their grasp, and that's when he heard it. Hoof beats, louder, heavier, and more numerous than before. A new cloud of dust was rising from beyond the ridge. He squinted, his blood running cold. It wasn't the scattered retreat of Morrison's men. It was the disciplined, thunderous advance of a fresh column. Dozens of them. A full company, their blue coats clean and unbloodied. And at their head rode an officer in a crisp hat, his face looking as if it were carved from granite. Elias knew the name before he was even told. A butcher famous for his efficiency in the territories. Colonel Bradley. Ayanna appeared at his side, her face pale beneath the grime of battle. Morrison wasn't the hunter, she hissed, her voice filled with dawning horror. He was the bait. The ridge, which had moments before been a scene of imminent victory, was suddenly a death trap. The air went still. The taste of gunpowder was replaced by the metallic tang of despair. Elias reloaded his rifle, his movements automatic, but his mind was reeling. They were exhausted. One of the women was bleeding out in the dirt. Their traps were spent, their element of surprise gone, and a fresh company of soldiers was advancing on their position. Colonel Bradley's voice boomed across the ridge, cold and devoid of emotion. "Surrender now and I will be merciful. Resist and every one of you will die." "He lies," Ayanna spat, her knife appearing in her hand. "Men like him mistake slaughter for mercy." The remaining Apache warriors rallied around her. Their faces were grim, their bodies weary, but their eyes still burned with defiance. Nia coiled her whip. Kara knocked another arrow, her arms stained with her own blood. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. But they were not broken. Elias's mind raced, his eyes darting across the familiar terrain. The cliffs, the gullies. He'd been so focused on the ambush that he hadn't planned for a siege. There had to be a way out. One last, desperate play. From her hiding spot, Mary watched them, her face a mask of pure terror. She clutched her baby, her eyes wide. The ghost in Elias's head started screaming again, a chorus of failure. "You led them into this. You failed again." He shoved the voices down. There was no time for doubt, no time for anything but action. But Ayanna moved first. She wasn't looking for an escape route. She was looking for a target. She gave a quick, subtle signal to Nia and Kara, who seemed to understand instantly. They separated, vanishing back into the brush like smoke. Elias saw Ayanna's eyes lock onto something in the advancing line of soldiers. Not Bradley, someone else. A younger rider, his uniform too clean, his face too pale. He rode close to the colonel, his eyes darting about nervously. He looked like a boy playing at being a soldier. Bradley's son. Elias understood her plan in a flash. It was insane. It was suicidal. It was their only chance. He moved to Mary's position. "Stay down," he whispered urgently. "Do not move, no matter what you hear." She gave a faint, terrified nod, the baby's whimpers muffled against her chest. Elias turned and followed Ayanna's path, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. She was circling wide, using the chaos of the battlefield to move unseen. He moved to a different position, raising his rifle, knowing what he had to do. Bradley's men advanced slowly, methodically, their rifles raised, flushing out the survivors. They were disciplined, unstoppable. A scream suddenly pierced the air. It wasn't one of pain, but of pure, unadulterated fury. Nia burst from the brush, her whip lashing out, not at a soldier, but at the legs of the young officer's horse. The animal shrieked and reared, throwing the boy to the ground. Before he could even scramble to his feet, an arrow from Kara's bow whizzed past his head, pinning the sleeve of his uniform to the muddy ground. He was trapped. And then Ayanna was on him, a blur of motion, a phantom of vengeance. She pounced, her knife pressed hard against the boy's throat before a single soldier could react. The entire battlefield froze. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, a thin trickle of blood running from where the arrow had grazed his arm. "Hold your fire!" Ayana shouted, her voice ringing with absolute command. She pressed the knife harder against the soft skin of the boy's throat. "One move, Colonel Bradley, and your son bleeds out in this dirt." The colonel's stone-carved face finally cracked, and a fissure of pure rage broke through his professional mask. "You dare!" he began, his voice a low growl. "I dare!" Ayana screamed back, her voice raw with the pain of her slaughtered people. "Your crimes end today, Bradley. Yours and Morrison's. The killing ends now." Bradley's men hesitated, their rifles wavering. They looked from the terrified boy to their furious commander, uncertainty warring with discipline. Elias held his breath, his rifle trained not on Bradley, but on the men closest to him. The boy's fear was real, but as Elias looked closer, he saw something else in his eyes, something he recognized from his own reflection in the long dark nights. Guilt. This boy wasn't just afraid for his life, he was carrying a secret. The ghost whispered to Elias, a new, urgent message. He knows. He knows what his father did. "Name your terms," Bradley said, his voice tight, reining in his fury. "There are no terms," Ayana snarled. "Only justice for my village, for my sister, for our dead." Elias knew in that moment that she would do it. Her grief was so immense, her rage so pure, she would sacrifice the boy, and all of them, for a moment of righteous vengeance. He had to stop her. He stepped out from behind his cover, his hands raised slightly to show he was no threat. "Ayana," he said, his voice low and calm. "Wait." Her glare was murderous. "You would spare this snake's spawn?" "He's not his father," Elias pressed, walking slowly closer. "Look at his eyes. He knows something. He can burn his father's world down in a way your knife never could." The boy's eyes darted away, a flicker of confirmation. "Let him speak," Elias urged. "Let his words be the weapon." Ayana's rage was a wildfire, but Elias's words were a bucket of water, hissing against the flames. She looked from Elias's pleading face to the boy's guilty one. "Talk," she snarled at the boy, the knife still at his throat, "or I will carve the truth out of you myself." The boy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against the blade. His voice, when it came, was a choked, trembling whisper. "I saw it," he said. "I saw my father's orders, the raids on the villages, the gold. Captain Morrison was just following his command. I saw it all, and I didn't. I didn't do anything to stop it." Bradley's face went white. His men began to murmur, their discipline finally, irrevocably cracking. Elias felt the tide shift. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Ayana's knife pressed in, drawing a thin line of blood. "Keep talking," she commanded. The boy's words began to spill out, a confession torn from a soul drowning in guilt. He spoke of ledgers, of secret shipments, of women and children murdered in cold blood, all for the gold hidden in Apache lands, all on the secret orders of his father. As he listened, Elias felt a strange, terrible hope warring with his rage. This confession wasn't just for Ayana's people, it was for his wife, for his daughters. It was the truth he had been denied for 5 long years. But as the boy spoke, Elias saw Colonel Bradley's eyes. The rage was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian focus. He saw the colonel's hand move, just slightly. A subtle signal, almost imperceptible, a signal to a sharpshooter hidden somewhere in the rocks above. And the rifle was aimed directly at Ayana's head. The ridge was a tableau of frozen violence. Ayana's knife at the throat of the son, the father's hidden order for her death hanging in the air, a promise of a bullet. Elias saw the glint of sun on a rifle barrel high up on the cliffs. A third-party shooter. Bradley had a man in reserve. Of course he did. The boy, Lieutenant Bradley, was still talking, his confession a torrent now, the words tumbling over each other. He spoke of specific dates, of wagons with false bottoms, of a secret ledger hidden in the floorboards of his father's office at Fort Duncan. Each word was a nail in the colonel's coffin. Elias had a choice, a split-second choice. Warn Ayana. and the boy might get his throat cut in the confusion. Shoot the colonel, and the sharpshooter would still fire. He did the only thing he could. He raised his own rifle, aimed at the distant glint on the cliff, and fired. The crack of his rifle shattered the tense silence. It was a long shot, an impossible shot. But rage and 5 years of solitary practice guided his hand. High on the cliff, a figure jerked backward and disappeared. Colonel Bradley spun around, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. In that single distracted moment, Aina acted. She didn't kill the boy. She slammed the pommel of her knife against his temple. He crumpled, unconscious. She grabbed him, using his body as a shield as she dragged him back toward the rocks. "Fire!" Bradley bellowed, his plan in ruins. The world exploded. Bradley's men, their loyalty shattered, but their discipline still intact, opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around Elias and Ayana. Kara and Nia laid down covering fire, their arrows and whip keeping the soldiers from advancing too quickly. But it was hopeless. They were still outnumbered, their hostage now useless as a bargaining chip. The soldiers began to advance, a wall of blue and steel. This was the end. And then a new sound entered the fray. Not a gunshot, a bugle call. Clear and sharp, it cut through the din of battle. Everyone froze. Over the crest of the hill, a new group of riders appeared. But they weren't wearing blue. They wore black coats, and their badges glinted in the morning sun. Federal marshals, 6 of them, armed with repeating rifles, their faces as hard as the Wyoming landscape. At their head was a man with steel gray hair and eyes that looked like they had seen everything twice. He raised a hand, and his voice cut through the sudden silence like a razor. "Colonel Bradley, U.S. Marshal Kane, by the authority of the United States government, I order you and your men to stand down." Bradley stiffened, his face turning a blotchy red. "You have no jurisdiction here, Marshal. This is a military action." "Wrong," Kane said, swinging down from his horse, his movements calm and deliberate. "This is a crime scene. We've been tracking your illegal gold shipments for months, Colonel. We heard reports of burned villages, of massacres. Funny thing is, your name kept coming up." Elias felt his heart hammering in his chest. The ghosts of his wife and daughters were silent for the first time in 5 years. They were just watching, waiting. Ayana dragged the now groaning Lieutenant Bradley to his feet, her knife once again at his throat. "Tell them," she hissed. "Tell them everything you told me." The young lieutenant, his head bleeding, his eyes filled with a strange mix of terror and relief, looked at Marshal Kane. His voice was no longer trembling. It was steady. "My father," he said, loud and clear for everyone to hear. "He ordered the raids. Captain Morrison carried them out. They stole Apache gold, slaughtered whole villages to cover it up. Women, children, everyone. I saw the orders. I saw the gold. It's all in a ledger hidden in his office at Fort Duncan." A collective gasp went through Bradley's men. It was one thing to follow orders. It was another to have the ugly truth of them laid bare under the eyes of the law. Rifles began to lower. A few clattered to the ground. The dam of loyalty had broken completely. Marshal Kane nodded slowly, his cold eyes fixed on the colonel. "That's enough to hang you, Bradley. You and every man who followed these orders. You're under arrest for murder and treason." Bradley made a guttural animal sound of rage and lunged for his saber. He never cleared the scabbard. Ayana moved like a striking snake, not with her knife, but with her foot. She kicked his legs out from under him, and he went down hard in the mud. Before he could recover, 2 marshals were on him, binding his hands behind his back. The fight was over. Elias finally lowered his rifle, his arms trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. His ghosts were quiet, not gone, but quiet. Ayana released the boy, shoving him toward the marshals. Her eyes met Elias's across the blood-soaked ridge. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a deep, profound weariness that he knew intimately. But in that look, there was also a silent acknowledgement, an understanding. They had done it. The baby's cry, soft and insistent, echoed from the gully where Mary was still hiding. It was a sound of life in a place of death, a reminder of what they had been fighting for. Marshal Kane approached Ayana. "Your people will be protected," he said, his voice softer now. "We'll see to it. We'll get your land in the north." "Words," Ayana said, her voice still hard. We have been fed promises before. Not from me, Cain replied, his gaze unwavering. You have my bond. And more importantly, he nodded toward the lieutenant, who was now in cuffs, his head bowed in shame. You have his testimony. He's going to burn this whole rotten system to the ground. Elias felt a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying begin to lift. His cabin, his solitude, his grief. It was all still there. But something had shifted. Something had broken free. He looked at Ayana, a warrior who had saved her people. He had helped. Maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As Cain's men rounded up the broken soldiers, Elias saw the colonel glaring at him, his eyes promising a death that would never come. The lieutenant was led away, his confession a chain he would carry for the rest of his life, but also perhaps his salvation. The ridge fell quiet. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of blood and rain and coming dawn. Elias turned to Ayana. It's over. No, she said, her voice steady as she looked toward the horizon. It's just beginning. He watched the prisoners being loaded into wagons. His past was still a part of him, a landscape of scars. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like the war inside him might not have to last forever. And that's when he smelled the smoke. He turned. A stray spark from the dynamite, or perhaps a lucky shot, had found the dry roof of his cabin. Small flames were licking at the weathered wood. His home, the prison he had built for himself. It was burning. The flames rose to meet the dawn, a pillar of orange and red against the gray sky. Elias didn't move to stop it. He just stood on the ridge and watched as 5 years of his life turn to ash. Everything he had left of his old life, his wife's worn rocking chair, his daughter's small carved horse, the very walls that had held his grief, was being consumed. The fire was a funeral pyre and a baptism. Ashes swirled in the wind, dancing like ghosts finally set free. Ayana came to stand beside him, her warriors gathered a short distance away. Nia was tending to the wound of their fallen sister, who was alive, but weak. Kara was cleaning her arrows. Mary rocked her baby, her eyes full of a quiet gratitude fixed on Elias. Marshal Cain walked over, his work done. You're all safe now, he said to Ayana. We'll provide an escort for your people to the northern territories. There's good land there. You have my word. Ayana's gaze was like steel. Your word is wind until my people are standing on that land, safe under their own sky. Cain nodded, accepting the rebuke. Fair enough, he said. You'll see it done. I'll make sure of it. He tipped his hat to them both and then turned to leave, his men herding the chained soldiers into a long, grim procession. Elias and Ayana were left in the quiet aftermath, the crackle of the fire the only sound. You got what you came for, Elias said, his voice hoarse. Not all of it, she said, her gaze distant. The dead are still dead, but it is enough, for today. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw the warrior's mask fall away completely, revealing the woman beneath. You didn't have to fight for us, but you did. I had to, Elias muttered, his eyes on the collapsing roof of his cabin. For me, for them. The faces of his wife and daughters flickered in the flames, and for the first time they were smiling. The accusing ghosts were gone. Ayana nodded, a deep understanding passing between them. We are heading north now, to try and rebuild. You could come with us. A man who knows how to fight, who knows this land. We could use you. It was a genuine offer, a chance at a new life, a new family, a new purpose. A part of him, the part that was so tired of being alone, wanted to say yes, but he shook his head. That's your path, not mine. He looked west, toward the endless, rugged horizon. I'm done hiding. There are other Morrisons out there, other Bradleys. I spent 5 years running from the wolves. It's time to start hunting them. She studied his face, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. She offered him her hand. He took it. Her grip was strong, her palm calloused, and equal. You're not a broken man anymore, Elias, she said. He let out a short, faint laugh. Close enough. The Apache women prepared to leave. Mary approached him, the baby cooing in her arms. Elias, she said softly, you saved us. I'll never forget it. He looked at the child, at her tiny hand reaching out, grasping at the air. The ache in his chest was still there, but it was different now. It was the tender ache of a scar, not the sharp pain of an open wound. Just keep her safe, he said. That's all the thanks I need. He watched them go, a small, resilient band walking toward a new beginning. Ayana glanced back once, her eyes locking with his in a final, silent vow. They would both carry the memory of this bloody dawn forever. When they were gone, Elias turned back to the smoldering ruins of his life. He salvaged what little he could, his rifle, a knife, a worn coat. His horse, which he tethered in a ravine, was safe. Everything else was gone. He was free. He mounted his horse and turned west, away from the rising sun, away from the ashes. The frontier stretched before him, wild and endless. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he was no longer running. The legend of that night on the ridge would spread, told in quiet tones in saloons and around campfires. They would speak of a stormy night, of 10 warrior women who appeared from the rain, and of a haunted rancher who was reborn in fire. They would call him the ghost of the ridge, a man who had faced down an army with a handful of heroes. But Elias never heard those stories. He was already gone. Riding west, a solitary figure against the vast horizon. The ghosts of his wife and daughters rode with him, not as accusers, but as companions. Their memory no longer a chain, but a compass. He had learned the hardest lesson of all on that ridge. The most important choice isn't between life and death, or right and wrong. It's the choice between the safety of your own solitude and the risk of fighting for someone else. He had chosen to fight, and it had saved him. The story of Elias and Ayana is a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of nights, a single spark of courage can set the world ablaze. If you were moved by their fight for justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss another story from the edge of the wild. And I have to ask you, drop a comment below and let me know. If you heard that knock on your door in the middle of the storm, what would you have done?